So thank you very much. I am Brenda Verkleon, and I have the pleasure of co-chairing the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Indigenous Reconciliation Committee here in the school. Well, not so, I am in the School of Rehabilitation Science right now, but within the Faculty of Health Science at McMaster. So welcome, and thanks for joining us this evening. As Whitney said, we are recording this session so that others are able, and we may have an opportunity also to go back and review it. So as you know, as you may know, the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Indigenous Health Equity Speaker Series was designed as an educational series that explores issues related to EDI and Indigenous health in an interprofessional, safe, and interactive environment. The speaker series explores topics that can have significant implications in the care of patients, treatment of research participants, and interactions in the educational environment. The goal is to provide faculty, staff, and learners a holistic understanding of EDI and Indigenous health issues and their impact in the clinical, research, and educational environments. So the Spring-Summer 2022 series, which we're kicking off this evening, focuses on accessibility in healthcare. And the first session is today, and in early May, we'll focus on accessible digital content. And I guess that's today. In May, we will also be hosting a session with Dr. Patricia Faruga on colonialism and accessibility in healthcare. And in June, we'll be presenting two panel sessions, the first of which focuses on reframing disability, and the second which will focus on accessibility in practice and work. And so for more information, you can contact Faculty Affairs, follow us on Twitter at faculty or at FHS_faculty or Fac Affairs. I did not do a good job of doing the Twitter, so we'll put that in the chat. But so as an occupational therapist, our profession, similar to others, has been doing lots of reflection about how we approach accessibility within our own profession and really reflect the abilities and diverse backgrounds within our own profession, as well as the clientele we serve. And we've been doing lots of reflection, particularly with regard to perpetuating an ableist culture. We have new competencies, and I was just reviewing those today because we are mapping our curriculum, and of course that's the next generation of professionals. And so we've added and foregrounded cultural equity and justice as a competency within our own profession. And underneath that, we have indicators that we are meant to meet in terms of our competencies that contribute to equitable access to occupational participation and occupational therapy. And that's why I'm excited that we have this summer series focused on this particular topic. So I hope you are too. So before we begin the session today and welcome our speakers, we'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. So McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Now, I'd like to introduce our guests who are going to be speaking this evening, Kate Brown and Jessica Blackwood. So Kate Brown, if you haven't had the pleasure of interacting with, and Kate, it's great to see you virtually again, is currently the Accessibility Program Manager within the Equity and Inclusion Office at McMaster. And since 2017, she has combined professional and scholarly approaches to translating accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act legislation into university culture, which underpins this work with an intentional focus on disability inclusion and co-design approaches with communities of students, staff, and faculties with disabilities. During this time, Kate has facilitated more than 800 accessibility, AODA, and/or disability inclusion related consultations to members of the McMaster community and academic workshops and training resources spanning topics of accessibility, accessible design, and teaching and learning, employment, leadership, and most relevant to today's discussion, digital accessibility. Through a wonderful partnership with McMaster colleagues in the digital media accessibility specialist, Jess Blackwood, Kate and Jess have developed McMaster's first accessible digital content training, which is open access. It's a press book, and it's facilitated more than 40 sessions, and they facilitated more than 40 sessions together on digital accessibility with more than 1,000 people within and external to the McMaster community. Jess Blackwood is the Accessible Digital Media Specialist in the Faculty of Science at McMaster University and a Health Sciences alumnus. Bachelor of Health Science in 2017, a Master's of Science in Rehab 2020, fantastic. They currently work to audit and remediate educational and promotional materials within the faculty and educate the McMaster community on how accessible and inclusive practices can be integrated into everyday practices in our digital world. In partnership with the Equity and Inclusion Office and Kate Brown, she has facilitated over 40 synchronous training sessions on digital accessibility and over 1,000 individuals at McMaster and beyond since 2020. Asynchronously, Jessica has helped develop and curate the accessible digital content training and that press book alongside Kate. So all of that to say, they've launched a remediation program for the Faculty of Science that focuses on the training and student employees to complete audit and remediation activities on science courses, website properties, and digital media. So we are in very good and experienced hands this evening. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jess and Kate.
Thanks, Brenda. I really think I need to rethink my bio sometimes because I'm like, Brenda is even editing it as it goes because it's definitely too long. So thank you for doing that. Welcome, folks. I think we're still adding people to the session as we're going. Feel free to keep cameras off, but Jess and I also love to see faces. So if folks want to turn their cameras on, especially if they want to participate in any conversation today, it would be fantastic. I'm going to start sharing my screen. There's now so many tabs along the bottom that I will do that right now. I just want to get you folks back up on my other screen so I can see who we're talking to. Okay. Actually, can I confirm? Can you see screen 2, folks? Can you see the press? Yes, Jess, thank you. Okay, slideshow. So welcome. This is the first in a series of 2 sessions. This first session is going to be focusing a little bit more on underpinning concepts and frameworks for digital accessibility. And then Jess is going to take us through a really helpful demo closer to the end of the presentation, probably in the last 45 minutes, 50 minutes, where she will provide structured tips. We're going to frame them as tips for this session. In the 201 session, we're hoping to provide a little bit more of a substantial deep dive, if I can use that terrible expression, into digital accessibility practice that anyone can take on and that is particularly relevant for anybody who's engaging in digital content creation. We will define what that means later on in the presentation, but essentially, if you can send emails, if you're posting to social media, if you're responsible for web content or creating digital documents, I think the tips today will be quite relevant to folks who are on the call. We've already had the land acknowledgement provided for folks in today's session. I might just ask Jess, because I can't access the chat, we have some links that we often pop into the chat during the land acknowledgement and have up on the screen the Every Child Matters logo, just in sort of recognition that there is still ongoing exhumation of mass burial sites taking place all around Canada. I think the last time that I heard the numbers were over 10,000 at this point, which is devastating and has seemed to have fallen out of popular media discourse. So it's sad and it's uncomfortable, but it's something that is still happening. And I think it's useful to understand just the breadth and the impact that residential schools have had on Indigenous folks who've been in Canada, or the lands called Canada, since time immemorial. So just wanted to add that little bit of extra specification into the land acknowledgement, as land acknowledgements should be personalized typically. So that's sort of our attempt to personalize for today's session. We've already done introductions. We've got logos up on the screen for the Access Mac program, which is the program that I oversee, as well as the McMaster University Science logo, which represents work that Jess does. And I just feel so lucky that Jess and I have been able to partner, because Jess isn't a central employee. She's embedded in the Faculty of Science, but she's been able, through a great partnership with the Faculty of Science, she's been able to work quite closely with me over the last couple of years, specifically in this area. So we are indeed in good hands. providing some goals for today, just to give some structure to today's presentation. I think maybe folks who had registered for the session would have seen the learning outcomes. So these might feel familiar: provision of definitions, and then we'll talk a little bit, just like a little bit, about provincial standards for accessibility, and then get really into the concrete strategies that folks can start implementing. We are recording today's session, so we encourage people to come back to the recording. Jess and I also tend to provide a plethora of resources for folks to do more engaged self-education. It's paced, it's staggered, there's quizzes. I mean, it's really just a well put together resource. I can brag about it because Jess did a lot of that work. And it's super useful if folks are working in Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, if you're working in Pressbooks, if you're working in web content or social media contexts of any kind. I think you'll find those resources useful. To contextualize, or just to provide a little bit of a link, hopefully the benefits, right? So the benefits of learning about definitions today. We always try to start from a place of context. You know, this is an EDI and Indigenous speaker series, so really grounding the work in an equity focus is essential. So that's sort of what the goal of the definition section is, and hopefully is a benefit to audience members today. We're hoping to provide a little bit of a framework, and so folks can understand tying into standards before we get into the nitty-gritty details. If you kind of go at it the opposite way and provide too many skills-based teaching and learning pieces before talking about the standards, sometimes the tasks can feel disconnected and disorganized, and folks don't really understand why they're being asked to do X, Y, and Z tasks with their media as they're developing digital assets. So just provide a little tiny bit of that guiding framework, and then we'll get right into the implementable techniques, which I think tends to be what motivates folks to stay till the end, is that they actually get to learn some hands-on techniques that they can start using right away. Whoops. We're just curious. So Jess and I were hoping that folks wouldn't mind engaging in a little bit of a Menti exercise, just as a bit of an icebreaker, because today is a little bit of a lecture style, but we're hoping still for some audience participation. Just wanting to know what folks are hoping to gain or learn from today's session. And it could be literally anything, even if you're just here to get an accreditation, that's completely valid, and feel free to put that in. This is an anonymous poll. So visit the Mentimeter, enter the code that's listed 269-32997, which I might ask Jess to pop in the chat as well. Or you can just open your camera, hover it over the QR code, and it'll take you to menti.com. I'm going to exit out of this screen so I can open up the Menti on my end as people are putting their answers in. So take a couple of minutes to do that. And we'll just keep that code up there. Ooh, this is great. Folks are so fast. I think I underestimate how quickly people are typing these days. Okay, so I will bring this up on this end. This is great, folks. Okay, so we've got goals of ensuring that documents are accessible, learning the latest methods, key tips or checklists. We do have one of those, by the way. We won't go through the checklist in today's session, but we most definitely have checklists that will send us follow-ups. Strategies to make docs and posts more accessible and usable, learning requirements for accessible documents. To that eager learner, I applaud you. Those requirements are ridiculous in terms of their technical language. So Jess and I provide some knowledge translated approaches that we can frame as requirements. Just so you know, we'll go through the techniques and say that this meets a requirement under the standards that we'll be referencing. Hoping to learn some digital platforms or ways to create an effective LMS, great goal. Think about how I can share my content differently, more accessibly, refresh my accessibility knowledge, and then practical ways to make content more accessible. Fantastic. I feel like we're actually quite united in our goals for today's session, which is great. Thank you for participating. And feel free, folks, please do pop things in the chat, raise your hand. I can't monitor that while I'm sharing my screen, but Jess will while I'm talking, and then I will monitor while Jess is talking. We have a good rapport that way. So just a little bit of context. I've done a few presentations thus far for folks who are in either medical science and or STEM backgrounds. And I've been told by several folks who I've done participatory workshops with that science students like stats. Like, it's very helpful to understand a broader context of stats. And so just to sort of contextualize a little bit more about why we're here, a bit of a macro context about disability and post-secondary education. These stats might not seem surprising to folks, but they're certainly, I find them discouraging. Like, I tend to find them discouraging that in 2015, I mean, these have been updated since probably 2017, but the numbers aren't that different. Approximately 14% of Canadians with disabilities obtain post-secondary degrees compared to 27% of Canadians without disabilities, and that 45% of students with disabilities, this one in particular, report their course or career trajectory being influenced or changed resulting from being disabled in post-secondary. So that's almost half of folks who experience disability in post-secondary, changing what their career goals are based on experiencing systemic barriers or interpersonal barriers in post-secondary. A little bit more specific to disability and STEAM, so that the A is art wedges its way into STEM professions. That numerous Ontario-focused reports and Canadian empirical studies indicate that disabled students or students with disabilities with evident or known disabilities are often discouraged altogether from pursuing STEAM. So I hear this a lot. You know, we're here to support and accommodate students, but we don't have any disabled students in STEM, which is not true. It's just that oftentimes a lot of folks with invisible disabilities end up in STEM fields or in STEAM fields. Also, students entering STEAM fields often experience significantly disabling environmental barriers that prevent them from participating. And this one's really interesting because automatically, especially when I would be chatting with folks who are, I've done presentations for chemistry, folks who are in maybe in lab settings, et cetera, they kind of tend to focus on the physical environment. Oh, well, that makes sense. How are you supposed to make a lab fully accessible to somebody who's maybe blind or who's deaf or low hearing, low vision, et cetera? But in fact, the primary barriers that were identified in several of these studies were attitudinal. So they weren't environmental, they were actually interpersonal barriers that most people were experiencing. And more specifically, little or no mentorship of students with disabilities entering STEAM disciplines. Students with disabilities in STEAM, particularly those with invisible disabilities, not having their accommodation needs met, stigma in the field, not knowing how to navigate the process. And so then students reporting across the board, either having to self-advocate for accommodation rights to be met or going without accommodation support, which typically leads to degree lengthening, course dropping, gaps in academic resumes, and lower GPAs, right? So that's sort of how that manifests in undergrad, and then going into grad school, it becomes much more difficult for students to apply to grad school. So it's a bit of a negative context, and I apologize for this being a bit negative to kind of start out our discussion today, but I think it's helpful for us to understand as a community who's really trying to unearth some of these issues, to recognize that they're primarily attitudinal and primarily have to do with interacting with systems that already exist for accommodation support or not having access to those systems that already exist. I'll take a breath before moving on. Any questions or comments that folks maybe have before moving into definitions? Also completely fine if not. Is there anything in the chat, Jess? I just wanted to double check. Nope, all good. All right. So let's ground ourselves before we can talk about accessibility, which is awesome and super exciting. Folks have to know about two things primarily: what disability is, or how it's been defined, and also how disability is modeled, right? Because this might be new information. It's completely fine if this is new information, but there are different ways of framing disability. I think I've read about 8 or 9 different popular models over the past 6 or 7 years. We will focus primarily on 3 models for today's presentation to frame discussion, and we're going to start with a discussion about just a basic definition of disability. So up on the slide, I've got 2 images. One is the international symbol for disability that's been modified with a combination of pride, like 2S LGBTQ plus colors, and the Black Lives Matter fist sort of upraised, which is an intersectionally focused representation of disability. So that disability is really the experience of people who typically have multiple marginalizations that they're experiencing at the same time. And then in the second image, it's a really cool image actually that has been put out for invisibilized disability. So the little icons inside of this modified international symbol for disability all point to representation of invisibilized disability. Not always, like a person who's holding a cane and also has a seeing eye dog might be readily identified as a person who's blind, but the CC is captions and the hands are sign language. The little infinity symbol are persons with autism or autistic folks. The person with the brain at the top are people who experience mental health disabilities. So just sort of two variations to disrupt narratives that disability is evident, that it is physical, that it is white, and that it is male, right? These are really strongly connotated representations of disability. Is a white person, typically male, in a wheelchair. That's not untrue. It just narrows sort of a really, really, really broad spectrum of what disability actually is. I do find it difficult to provide one streamlined definition. The definition varies dramatically across the province, across the country. It's often shifting depending on things like eligibility criteria, insurance criteria. To be a person with a disability is to lead a very bureaucratic and administrative existence. If somebody is forced to depend on social supports in particular, there's often a lot of red tape that goes into that existence. We at the university, so I'll say like the university capital U, as in all of the policies that integrate disability protection into the university, we use the Ontario Human Rights Code definition of disability. I will maybe, just if it's possible for you to send that link, I've got a link to the OHRC definition of disability. Summarized, it includes a broad range and degree of conditions, some of which are visible, many of which are invisible. We know that it's essential not to presume or assume the presence or absence of disability, generally speaking. Lots of folks have run into trouble where they have sort of presumed that somebody is experiencing disability when they're not, and maybe have taken actions based on that presumption. It could have been present from birth. It could have been caused by an accident. It may have developed over time. But interestingly, for today's discussion, we're going to talk a lot about, less about embodied experience of disability and more about how people who experience embodied difference interact with environments. And when those environments are not designed for them, how disablement can occur. So that's a different way of framing disability for today's presentation. I might also mention something that we don't typically talk about, but helps to bring in an intersectional lens, is that very often disability can be related to systemic oppression, discrimination, intergenerational trauma. This might inhibit somebody from framing their experience as such. They might be fearful of stigma. They might not know that what they're experiencing is disability, or they may not have ever thought about that as such, but oftentimes they do fall under protected rights under the definition that exists for Ontario. And although sections 10A to E of the code set out various types of conditions, they're just illustrative, so they're not exhaustive. This particular definition keeps growing, like it's very nuanced and it's very broad, the definition that Jess has popped into the chat there. So thanks for doing that, Jess. And maybe just a note, if folks on the call experience disability themselves, and if you require academic or workplace accommodations as students, student staff, employees, faculty, etc., there are supports available. Like there are pathways towards supports. Please do let me know if you need any support navigating those systems. Grad students and students tend to go through student accessibility services. Employees go through employee health, like human resources services through employee health services. And then folks that straddle that line, folks who are sort of grad students who are also TAs, RAs, part-time employees, they also have supports available under Human Resources Services, which folks don't often know about. So I just wanted to make that a little bit more explicit. Up on the screen here, I have an image that was developed for our Flex Forward Accessible Education Teaching and Learning resource. And it's actually great. Rehabilitation was one of the first, I would say, programs in the university to really jump on the Flex Forward train. And that's been really helpful because reading through different professional schools and how they've adopted principles that are laid out within this teaching and learning resource has just been so heartening to see how folks are really trying to integrate accessible practice and universal design into their teaching and learning practices, in particular in professional schools, where designations and accreditation is a big deal. So just a little bit of shout out there. Occupational therapy has also, I've seen lots of work that they've been doing after in the last little while around implementing principles from the Flex Forward FAVE resource. This particular image is quite illustrative. Sometimes folks can have a bit of a strong reaction. There's a person sitting at a desk. There's two little titles. One says internal problems on the left-hand side. On the right is external barriers. The left-hand side represents what we would call a medical model of disability. We've got arrows pointing in toward an individual with harmful labels: insane, disorder, defect, sick, abnormal, deficient, diagnosis, mistake, broken. Diagnosis isn't always a negative term, by the way. It just can be in certain contexts when it's weaponized to keep people from being able to access accommodations. And then on the right-hand side, external barriers with a bunch of arrows pointing out toward communication, technological, organizational, systemic, physical, architectural, attitudinal, disabling environment, and human rights violations. And so historically, Western societies within a medical model of disability have viewed disability as deficiency residing in a person's body and or mind, which is why all of the arrows are pointing inward towards the person. From this perspective, disability is seen as something abnormal, bad, pathological, problematic, something that needs to be fixed, cured, removed, hidden, or minimalized. Non-disabled bodies are seen as normal. They're seen as healthy, better, and good, and disabled bodies are seen as bad. So this leads to the poor treatment of folks with disabilities, who are often in a social context, right? So in a socioeconomic context, not strictly within a medical or a bio context, are often devalued and disrespected and pushed out of our communities, including our digital communities. And these sorts of perspectives, treatments, and impacts are typically referred to as, like I mentioned before, the medical model. There are strengths to the medical model. Of course, we're dealing with medical professionals in today's presentation, including acknowledging potential biological conditions that within a clinical setting can really and obviously support the development of a biological criteria to support diagnosis and treatment of an individual. However, a significant limitation of this model is that it can be so focused on identifying these defects within the individual that it fails to pay attention to significant problems in our society and the role of our physical, social, and attitudinal environments in either producing barriers or promoting accessibility and inclusion. This defect focus can also be seen as permeating into non-medical, non-clinical settings, which is why we're talking about it today, because it does permeate all the way through into how we've developed digital tools and how we do work in digital environments, just to make that connection more explicit for folks. So we kind of want to shift that focus a little bit away from the individualized experiences of disability and shift it over more towards a social and human rights model for today's discussion, right? To frame today's discussion. So the social model and the human rights model are two approaches that emphasize structural barriers in society, as well as disabled people's rights to be included and treated fairly. Examples of these barriers could include, as mentioned in the diagram, physical, architectural. We know, like stairs, poor sound quality, lack of washrooms, accessible or all gender washrooms are just some examples. And then maybe a little bit more specific to today's discussion under information and communication, You know, when we're only providing communications in dominant languages or in one type of document, when we don't have translators available, tech barriers could be, for example, what we're going to talk about today. Documents are incompatible with screen readers, other assistive tech, lack of closed captioning for videos, and no transcripts for audio recordings. Just being some examples of how we can kind of learn to audit and recognize that these barriers have been designed for, right? So when you're designing for a specific audience, it's often to the exclusion of other audiences. And so in designing for quote unquote healthy, able-bodied people, oftentimes folks that are perceived as disabled and sick have not been designed for. And so we're just going to shift that narrative a little bit today, and we're going to talk about designing for and being intentional about that design for persons with disabilities. So just want to do a little Mentimeter because I've been doing a lot of talking and recognize that that could be overwhelming. If folks wouldn't mind going to the same Mentimeter, I'm just going to progress to the next slide, entering the same code. And I just want to know how you folks define or conceptualize accessibility before we start to give you a more formal definition of what accessibility is. I'm interested to know how other people define it, but first I have to progress out of this slide before doing that. So sorry if it's not progressed yet because I've got too many screens open. Okay, it should have been moved over now and folks should be able to access that slide. Please let me know if you can't access that slide to enter into the Menti. And can I ask Jess, is there anything in the chat to pay attention to? No, all good. So are people able to access that? I'm just asking because there we go.
In the chat,
okay.
Kate,
Okay.
just getting the same question as the first time.
Sorry, Jenna. I thought that I had progressed. That's bizarre. Okay, let me present again and then progress through. Okay, please let me know if that worked. There we go. Fantastic. Glad that worked. Got a few answers popping up. Amazing. Okay, this is great. All right, I'll share this screen. I've actually lost all the people on my side. So maybe, Jess, could you verbally indicate? Oh, there you go. Yeah, I think you can see all the answers. Okay, so literally that all people can access information and activities needed to achieve their goals, the practice of making your communications usable by as many as possible. Everyone can equitably access a service, resource, etc. Documents or spaces that all individuals are able to access or view without the need for accommodations, inclusive for all, and the environment made to fit all. Thank you for your participation, folks. So I might encourage you all, great answers by the way, but I might encourage you to critically consider this definition. It's from the Ontario Human Rights Code, that in fact, accessibility, yes, the broader goal, of course, it's great to make everything accessible for all. Like that's an amazing goal. Accessibility in law is actually specific to folks with disabilities. And the idea is that if you intentionally design for certain disabilities that are consistently interacting with environments where it's like really difficult for people to access services, education, social situations, buildings, etc., that you will enhance access for all. But the intentional focus is that you would make something, a device, a service, a physical environment that can be accessed, used, and enjoyed by persons with disabilities. It's conscious planning, design, and or effort to make sure something is barrier-free to folks with disabilities. And then as a fringe benefit, as an additional benefit, you end up making things overall beneficial to the general population. In particular, folks who are not often and shouldn't be conceived under a disability definition, but who might also be experiencing barriers like children, older folks, people who are pregnant, like people who are going to have to shift in the environment in a different way than somebody who's exceptionally able-bodied or who's, you know, a certain height, for example, or a certain size, for example. So it's just helpful to think about. It can become overwhelming when you try to think about access as being access for all, because then you start to think about all the things all at once, and it can be much more helpful to kind of narrowly focus in on a couple of key areas through intentional design that then have additional benefits to additional audiences of people. Within the digital accessibility context, we're describing making electronic content available and usable by everyone at the same time with the same use, including and especially focusing on persons with disabilities. And this at the same time with the same use is a really, really difficult goal to achieve. I would say it's simple with basic documents, with basic text, but when you start talking about complex technological or technologies, for example, it can be difficult to give somebody, for example, a similar experience learning about technical drawings or learning about an exceptionally complex diagram who's maybe visually impaired compared to somebody who's not visually impaired. And so that in particular takes a lot of thought, a lot of design, and a lot of consultation with folks who are blind and visually impaired to get right. And thankfully, we do have experts. We have experts at MAC who do that kind of work. It is not the expectation that folks who are new to digital accessibility would be able to do such detailed and complex digital accessibility work right off the bat, or maybe ever. You know, it's very specialized work. Before we get into our hands-on discussion with Jess, just so that we can kind of understand ableism. Ableism to me, kind of like racism, homophobia, transphobia, they're broad concepts. They're concepts that can sometimes make folks, you know, react depending on your familiarity with the term or any previous education you've had about the term. And sometimes they can feel intangible, like not understanding how to recognize what that actually looks like in your environment. So broadly, ableism is a form of discrimination. It's encoded as such in the Ontario Human Rights Code, in human rights law. It is the false idea that disabled people are by default inferior, when in truth, disability is just another way for a mind and or body to be. It is also one of the largest contributors to discrimination. So it's not just a form of discrimination, it almost always, when you kind of track back cases, case law around discrimination as it relates to persons with disabilities can almost always be tracked back to ableist, at least some form of ableism that's arising in the environment or through interpersonal interaction. Systemic ableism, I think this one's a little bit easier to recognize. And I think folks might feel some, I hate the word resonance, but it's appropriate for this conversation, a bit of resonance when you see the examples on the right-hand side of the screen. Captions not being embedded by default in the video streaming platform. So this isn't just about people turning on the captions. This is when, for example, for the first 18 months of the pandemic, Zoom didn't have captions. We didn't have auto captions enabled in our accounts. And so people had to do so much work to work around that technological barrier. It was incredible, the solutions folks were coming up with, but they were really trying to subsidize what should have been embedded in the technology to begin with. And so that wasn't done particularly well or in a coordinated fashion because everyone was just trying to do their best. And they were really trying to do their best, or they switched over to Teams, which had auto captioning embedded. Reminders to add alternative text to visuals not being added to CMS, LMS platforms, or if they're difficult to find in the platform. This is really common in social media. This is really common in a CMS environment that's been custom built. In certain environments, there is a stopgap. Before you post your image, it'll say you can't post this image without alternative text. So they actually prohibit the media from being circulated, which is fantastic because people forget. If it's not common practice, if you don't do it all the time, you will forget. And also when you're first starting to learn that technique in particular, it's kind of complex. It's not the easiest technique out of all the digital accessibility tools. So having actual physical stop gaps or having that very obviously displayed in the back end of a social media account, for example, which it's not in many social media accounts, is just extraordinarily helpful, and it really elevates accessibility as being important in terms of the development of that platform. And then one that is an interesting one, that's recommended color combinations for branding. So just generally, when an organization has branding standards, any kind of organization, they might provide you with the color palette, but they don't provide you with instructions on how to combine the colors. And so folks will oftentimes just do whatever. They'll do what looks pretty. They'll do what suits their environment or what they perceive as being attractive aesthetically if they're sighted people. But then they might combine colors. The contrast is just terrible, and then folks can't read because maybe they're low vision or maybe they're colorblind. They can't actually perceive the information particularly well. And it's an easy fix. You provide people the color palette, and then you tell them the recommended color combinations, and you just take that decision out of people's hands so that they don't have to think about it, and so that they can trust that what they're being told is accurate and legal, meeting compliance. How do we begin to do this, right? Like as we're sort of narrowing the focus of today's presentation, broadly in terms of a legislative framework, in Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. I apologize, I've got a lowercase d, which is an accident. That should be uppercase. Within the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is big, broad umbrella legislation, there are several standards. One of the standards is the Information and Communication Standard. And within that standard, one of the requirements of like 100 requirements is that all public-facing websites and web content, which includes social media, which includes anything posted to a website, which includes anything publicly circulated, has to meet what are called WCAG 2.0. So WCAG is the Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines. That's the name of the guidelines. And then 2.0 AA is the actual level that we're required to meet under Ontario law. That might change in the next year. We might actually be required to meet 2.1 standards, which hasn't happened yet, but just letting folks know that that legislation might change as a result of a review of the Information and Communication Standard. These standards are super broad. They're broad, they are technical, they're difficult to understand for non-technical people. They include requirements for digital environments, templates, CMS, digital content. I've got some descriptions in here of public-facing digital HTML writing, documents, PDF and Word, images, tables, video and audio content, all inclusive. And then in terms of who's responsible, like who actually is supposed to be following these requirements, I think obviously IT professionals, web managers and content creators, but oftentimes because we've digitized so much and because we work in an academic environment, teaching and learning professionals, and broadly anyone publishing public-facing online materials, which is really big and really broad. We're not going to try to overwhelm folks by going into too many details about all the things that you could be doing. We're going to narrowly focus on a few things and simplifying how we're going to frame what we're going to focus on. We're going to follow the POUR principles, which are just so helpful. These are principles used for all digital accessibility contexts. You want your content and your media to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. The first three principles, I think, are pretty clear. If the content is perceivable, it means the end user knows it's there. It means that if there's text on the screen, somebody can also hear that text, as well as being able to read it. Operable, if there are buttons on the screen, people can click on the buttons. If there are captions, people can click on the caption button, they can open the captions. If they need to progress throughout a course, if it's on storyline or articulate storyline, they can progress through the storyline with buttons, for example. And understandable, I like to compare it, like I like to translate it a little bit more towards plain text. Plain text is a really good example of making content understandable, trying to apply plain text principles as best as possible. Jess, I'm not sure if we have the little tool that we use for plain texting readily available. If you wouldn't mind popping that in the chat, it's super helpful. You just copy and paste your text into it and it tells you what the reading level is, which I find amazing. Robust is maybe not so easy to grasp on for if folks aren't familiar with web development. So I don't want to lose the audience by talking too much about that principle. It essentially means that if you have a website or any kind of a digital interface and folks have to be able to navigate through that interface independently, there's enough information that's been coded into it that somebody using a screen reader or another form of assistive tech knows what to do. They know how to progress through the menu, they know how to open items on the website, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of all I'll tell you about robust. And then simplifying even more, before we get into the actual how-tos, I've got on the left-hand side, types of digital materials. And then on the right-hand side, it's this accessibility +1 formula around adding one additional sensory modality to your content. So if you've got written content, articles, handouts, essays, emails, try to ensure that they are machine readable. And Jess will help us understand that a little bit more, what that means, or HTML, Word docs, Outlook emails, accessible PowerPoint slides, web pages, all good choices. Videos, captioned, podcasts, transcripts, print texts. We actually have really robust EPUB service through our library services. And in fact, we were able to collect great information from our library accessibility services, which we've put into our press book that Jess and I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which details accessibility in EPUBs, if anyone's interested in that. And then images, alternative text, which we will talk a little bit more about in the practical part of the presentation. Alternative text is defined as literally text alternative. So if you have an image, you have something that describes the image that gets layered onto the image in a way that's typically not visible to a sighted user, but more and more I see folks, especially on social media, making their alternative text visible to sighted people. And there's lots of reasons for that, lots of opinions about why and how people do that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So just to pause, because that was like an incredible amount of information coming at you all. It's 50 minutes into the presentation before we hop into the practical stuff. Do folks have any questions, any comments, any thoughts so far? You can put it in the chat, you can raise your hand. You know, for any kind of interaction is good interaction. I'm not sure, Jess, if there is anything in the chat. I just see, like, I always see chat on my side because I'm not checking it. Pam's thumbs up.
Pam's done a thumbs up. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And it's fine if you don't have any questions, but
yeah, all good. I completely appreciate sort of receptive learning. I really appreciate receptive learning, especially at the end of the day, past the end of the day. Okay, so now I'm going to hand things over to Jess, who's going to take us through our tips and tricks.
yeah, alrighty. I'm assuming you stopped screen sharing. So
I did.
Will share my screen.
Yeah, okay, I'm just one sec, Jess. I'm just looking at Lynn's comment. So Lynn, I hope you'll be happy to know that the recommendation, so part of, it's not a problem, it's a reality, is that when WCAG was developed, it was developed with what are called objective criteria. So something that could be tested as a yes or no. And cognitive disabilities were typically kind of, I would say, minimized because they were perceived as being almost subjective experiences, that they didn't have objectively testable cases that they could create for everyone around the world to be able to create more accessible stuff for folks with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. However, I believe it's in WCAG 2.1. I think, where
Yes.
there's quite a bit of an elevated focus on cognitive disabilities, where there is objectively testable criteria that's been included in that version of WCAG. And I think there's also been an entire guideline that's been developed for how to create accessible content for folks with cognitive disabilities that sort of ties into emerging practices under WCAG. So it's very slow, like it's so slow for this to be updated in Ontario. The practices are coming. Like this has been a substantial critique of the practices in the past 10 years, probably. Good point. So just reading and just responding to your comments here, Lynn. Good point. Yes, but the WCAG cognitive standards and guidelines do not have cited evidence to support them. I mean, I think I can maybe generally make a comment that part of this is that I think some of this is experimentation in real time. Like I think that folks are trying to do applied research while they're developing these standards. And so I'm hoping that more cited evidence emerges as the WCAG standards are applied a little bit more broadly, especially in the areas of cognitive disabilities. But I think we're waiting on that research, right? Great comments though, and keep commenting in the chat or put your hand up if you would like to jump into the conversation.